The engagement ring Thomas slipped onto Eliza's finger wasn't just a diamond. It was a promise her daddy, Pastor John, had spent 17 years polishing. It was heavy, respectable, and perfectly suited to the daughter of the first man in Harmony Creek to speak the word of God on a Sunday morning. Thomas himself was a suitable man. Steady, with a good plot of land and pockets that knew the feel of hard-earned paper money. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was usually about futures and foundations, things a church-going woman was taught to value over the wild, useless flutterings of the heart. Eliza accepted it all with the practiced grace of a girl who knew her role. She smiled for the photographs, listened patiently as the ladies of the congregation cooed over the size of the stone, and allowed her mother to start planning the grandest church wedding the town had ever seen. The only thing that made her breath catch in her throat was the thought that this whole well-ordered future had to be cemented in the very same sanctuary where Ben sat every single Sunday. Ben, who played the piano like he was arguing with God, telling him all the beautiful, messy truths that Eliza kept locked behind her smile. The music was the only place their spirits ever touched anymore. A hidden conversation in the public square. She had known Ben since they were knee-high, and she knew the silence of his disapproval was louder than any thunder Thomas could ever manage. The date was set for the second Sunday in October, a perfect, crisp fall day, and the clock was already ticking down to the moment she had to make her well-behaved lie permanent. The heat rising off the asphalt felt like a physical pressure, urging her toward the inevitable, the safe harbor of Thomas's predictability. Ben saw the ring from the choir loft. He didn't need the close-up view. The way the sunlight caught the diamond was a cruel, flashing semaphore signaling the end of a secret hope he hadn't even realized he'd been holding on to. He was perched on the bench, his fingers tracing the ivory keys, waiting for Pastor John to finish the closing prayer. The air in the sanctuary was thick with old wood and the collective scent of Sunday best, but Ben only smelled dust and failure. He looked at Eliza, radiant beside her father, her hand resting delicately on Thomas's sturdy arm, and he understood. He understood that love wasn't enough when faced with duty, reputation, and the heavy weight of a town's expectation. She was the shepherd's daughter, meant to be an example, not a dreamer. When he finally brought his hands down for the postlude, the familiar hymn Amazing Grace became a confession. The notes swelled, not in the polite, measured way the organist usually played, but with a raw, almost violent tenderness. He pushed the music, forcing the chords to weep and soar, hoping some part of her soul, even buried under layers of white lace and good intentions, would hear the desperate question he couldn't ask aloud. Is this what you truly want? He watched her eyes flicker toward him just once, a tiny, impossible movement that confirmed she heard every single note. Then she looked away, back toward the future she had chosen, and Ben finished the hymn, letting the last, unresolved chord hang in the silence like a dropped glass. Pastor John called Thomas his anchor. He'd say it over Sunday dinner, right after the benediction, while Eliza was clearing the heavy porcelain plates. Thomas is an anchor, Eliza. He's not flashy, but he's solid. A man of rock in a sea of changing tides. The pastor, a large man whose voice was built for filling cavernous rooms, never mentioned Ben. It was as if the boy who spent every waking hour pouring his heart into the church's upright piano simply didn't exist outside of the musical staff paper. But Ben did exist, and his existence was a raw nerve in the family's carefully constructed piece. He ran the small, struggling general store downtown, smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books, and had never owned a tie that didn't look like it was fighting him. He was poetry and Thomas was arithmetic. The conflict wasn't just between the two men. It was between the two halves of Eliza. One half, bred by the pulpit, yearned for the respectability Thomas offered, the quiet, predictable life where she'd never cause her father a moment's shame. The other half, the part only Ben's minor chords could reach, wanted the messy, vibrant, unpredictable chaos of real passion. She found herself walking to the store more often, inventing excuses to buy mundane things. A spool of thread, a pound of flour, just to hear the rumble of Ben's voice when he wasn't singing through the keys. Each visit was a dance on the edge of a cliff, a silent, mutual acknowledgement of the beautiful disaster they were preventing. The wedding preparations were a runaway train, gathering speed and steam with every passing day. Eliza's mother, a woman who saw the world through the lens of proper social appearance, was in her element, directing the color scheme and the seating charts like a seasoned general. The main conflict now was lace versus satin, a trivial fight that masked the true war raging inside Eliza's chest. She felt suffocated every decision, from the shade of ivory for the tablecloths to the hymns for the ceremony, was being made by the committee of her reputation, not by her own desires. Thomas, for his part, remained the immovable rock. He offered opinions sparingly, mostly agreeing with Pastor John, confirming his suitability by showing a complete lack of emotional fuss. This placid acceptance was meant to be comforting, but to Eliza, it felt like being slowly enclosed in concrete. She wanted him to argue, to show a flash of jealousy or a moment of deep, possessive love, anything that might justify the huge leap she was about to take. But he just smiled his slow, confident smile and talked about adding a sunroom to their future house. Meanwhile, the choir practiced on Wednesday nights, and Ben was always there, head bowed over the keyboard. During a break, while her mother was discussing floral arrangements, Eliza risked a moment, catching his eye across the empty pews. He didn't smile, he didn't move. He simply held her gaze, and in that silent, burning connection, she saw a future. A different, scarier, infinitely more alive future. Flash and die. The tension was becoming unbearable, a hum beneath the floorboards of the church, and the wedding day felt less like a celebration and more like an execution of her true self. The dress arrived from the city in a long, tissue-shrouded box, smelling faintly of clean linen and possibility. It was heavy silk, pristine white, and utterly, perfectly traditional. When Eliza's mother finally fastened the buttons up the back, the fabric felt like armor, stiff and unyielding, designed to protect her from her own rebellious thoughts. Standing before the three-way mirror in her darkened bedroom, Eliza didn't see a bride. She saw an exhibit. A perfect, silent daughter ready to be handed off to the perfect, silent husband. Her mother wept a few quiet, happy tears, murmuring about how beautiful and right she looked, completely missing the hollow look in Eliza's eyes. Later that evening, unable to bear the confines of the house and the oppressive silence of her decision, Eliza slipped out. She walked past the darkened store where Thomas was likely reviewing ledgers, and instead found herself at the church. It was late, but a single yellow light spilled from the window of the back chapel. She knew before she reached the door who was there. Ben was playing not a hymn, but a piece he had written himself, mournful and complex, a melody that sounded like a question begging for an answer. She stood in the shadow of the massive oak, listening, the music wrapping around her like a living thing. When he finally stopped, she pushed the door open just enough to see him resting his forehead on the cool wood of the piano. "That was beautiful, Ben," she whispered, her voice husky with unshed tears. He lifted his head slowly, and the look he gave her was pure, unadulterated grief. He didn't say a word about the wedding, the dress, or the future, but the silence between them was the loudest, most honest conversation they had ever had. Thomas threw a modest, formal dinner for their close friends and the core church elders. It was meant to be an evening of mingling, showcasing the couple's maturity and shared values. Eliza found herself performing the role of the attentive future wife, fetching drinks, nodding at talk of property taxes, and laughing at the appropriate measured intervals. Thomas watched her with an approving, proprietary air that made her skin crawl. It wasn't love in his eyes. It was possession. He saw her as the final, necessary piece of his perfect, respectable life. The conversation turned to the wedding ceremony. "And Ben is playing the piano, of course," one of the elders mentioned. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a momentary crack in the solid facade. "He is," Thomas replied, his voice flat, "but I've requested he stick to the traditional arrangements. Nothing too expressive." The comment was subtle, but it was a declaration of ownership, a deliberate attempt to neuter the one uncontrolled element in Eliza's life. Eliza felt a rush of cold anger, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge since the engagement. Ben's music wasn't expressive. It was real. Later, when the guests were gone and Thomas was walking her home, he tried to kiss her, a deliberate, heavy attempt at physical connection. She turned her face, offering her cheek. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly in the dark. "You're nervous," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact that allowed for no argument. "It's a big step. You'll settle in." His predictability, once a comfort, was starting to feel like a cage with no lock. She realized then, with a sickening clarity, that Thomas was not just marrying Eliza. He was marrying Pastor John's daughter, and the latter was far easier to control. The dream was always the same. Eliza was standing at the altar, the entire congregation a blur of judgmental faces, and Thomas was holding her hand, but his grip was iron. When she looked down, the hem of her white dress was slowly turning to gray mud, creeping up her ankles. The organ music would swell, deafening and formal, but beneath it, like a frantic heartbeat, she could hear Ben's melody. He wasn't playing the piano. He was playing the tune of her own terrified longing. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, the crisp autumn air of her bedroom offering no comfort. The dreams became a nocturnal siege, breaking down her defenses, making the days feel unreal. She started counting the minutes until Sunday, not with anticipation, but with dread. The physical and emotional exhaustion was starting to show. Her mother noticed the dark circles under her eyes, attributing them to wedding jitters and prescribing chamomile tea and early nights. But Eliza knew it wasn't jitters. It was a soul trying to tear itself free from a life sentence. She was losing weight, the beautiful silk dress feeling looser with every fitting. One afternoon, her mother showed her the final printed program, listing the hymns and the order of the ceremony. Under ceremonial music, in elegant script, it read, Benjamin Cole, pianist. Just seeing his name, neatly typed beside the official proceedings, was enough to make her hands shake. He was woven into the fabric of her commitment, the final agonizing irony of the whole arrangement. The wedding wasn't just a ceremony of joining. It was going to be a public, musical eulogy for the life she'd never live. The rehearsal dinner was held in the church annex, a room usually reserved for potlucks and bake sales. The atmosphere was stiff, the forced jollity of two families who were only connected by the impending contract. Thomas's family, solid, unsmiling farmers, sat on one side. The pastor's family and church elders, polished and slightly anxious, sat on the other. Ben, as the official musician, was present for the rehearsal itself but was pointedly not invited to the dinner. Yet he was there. Eliza spotted his old, beat-up truck parked around the corner of the building as they ate. He was sitting inside, the small dome light casting a faint yellow glow on his face, working on some sheet music spread across the steering wheel. He was doing his job, finalizing his arrangements, but his presence, like a stubborn shadow, felt like a silent protest against the entire event. Eliza excused herself to fetch something from the car, an unnecessary errand, and walked right past the truck. She didn't slow down, didn't turn her head, but she saw him. He didn't look up. He knew she was there. The truth of their bond existed entirely in the spaces between words, in the things left unsaid. It was the knowledge that in a room full of people who were meant to love her, the man sitting alone in a truck knew her better and wanted her more truly than any of them. That night, she didn't sleep. She walked out onto the porch swing, the cool night air clearing her head, and admitted the dangerous truth. If Ben had ever asked her to run, she would have gone. But Ben had never asked. He was as bound by honor and respect for the pastor as she was by duty. 2 days before the wedding, Eliza was summoned to the church to approve the final flower arrangements. The sanctuary was already transforming, draped in white linen and overflowing with cream-colored roses that smelled too sweet, too sickly. The air felt heavy with the perfume of expensive preparation. While her mother was deep in discussion with the florist about pew bows, Eliza wandered toward the altar. The space was enormous and empty, and she could feel the weight of every gaze that would soon be fixed on her. She reached out and touched the cool, smooth wood of the communion rail, tracing a faint old scratch. That's when she saw it. A small, tightly folded piece of paper tucked discreetly into the spine of the old hymnal left on the piano bench. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced around, her mother's back was still turned, and snatched the note. It was Ben's handwriting, stark and beautiful, written in pencil. The song I'll play for your recessional isn't on the program. It's the one we used to whistle when we skipped rocks by the river. If you change your mind, find the blue ribbon in the oak tree by the spring. I'll wait there for an hour, right after the final hymn. Don't do this, Eliza. Ben. The note was a physical jolt, a shocking breach of their silent code. It was a lifeline thrown across a vast, impossible chasm. It gave her an escape, but it also placed the entire responsibility for the inevitable public scandal squarely on her shoulders. Her knees felt weak. She refolded the paper and tucked it into the bodice of her blouse, a terrible, thrilling secret pressing against her heart. The discovery of the note ignited a feverish internal debate. The voice of her father, the voice of the church, and the voice of the town screamed the consequences. Scandal, shame, and the utter destruction of her family's reputation. Pastor John would never recover from the humiliation. Thomas would be publicly disgraced. The quiet life, the steady future, would dissolve into messy, awful gossip. But against this deafening chorus, Ben's voice, filtered through the memory of a childhood whistle tune, sounded louder. It was the call of true companionship, the promise of a life where she didn't have to constantly shrink herself to fit into a respectable box. She spent the entire day in a haze, her hands trembling as she helped hang a decorative banner in the reception hall. She kept touching the note hidden against her skin, feeling the rough texture of the paper and the sharp edge of the pencil writing. She realized the blue ribbon was a symbol, a challenge. It wasn't just a simple escape. It was an invitation to a difficult, uncertain freedom. That night, Thomas came by to drop off a small, antique music box, a wedding gift he wanted her to have early. He watched her carefully as she opened it. "It plays a simple, pretty tune," he said, his eyes drilling into hers. "Something uncomplicated." His implication was clear. "Keep your life and your heart simple, Eliza. Keep it with me." She thanked him, her smile stretched thin. The conflict had moved from internal debate to external confrontation, and Thomas, without knowing the note existed, was throwing down his own silent, controlling gauntlet. Eliza's mother found the blue ribbon. It wasn't the actual ribbon, which was still tied to the old oak by the river, but a piece of blue velvet ribbon tucked inside Eliza's cedar chest, a remnant from a high school dance. She held it up during a frantic, last-minute search for a misplaced veil pin. "What's this, dear?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes sharp. "Something old? Blue?" Eliza froze, the air seizing in her lungs. She mumbled a vague answer about a forgotten craft project, but her mother's expression didn't change. It was a moment of pure, terrifying detection. The mother who had always been so focused on surfaces now seemed to be peering into the depths of Eliza's deception. That brief flash of suspicion was enough to unnerve Eliza completely. She realized she had to destroy the note. She couldn't risk her mother finding the physical proof of her planned betrayal. In the quiet of her room, she took out the folded paper, reading Ben's plea one last time. "Don't do this, Eliza." The words seemed to burn into her memory. She took a deep, shaky breath, held a match to the corner of the paper, and watched it curl and turn black, the tiny flames licking away her chance at a clean getaway. The scent of burnt paper, subtle and acrid, hung in the air, a silent, definitive funeral for the truth. She felt a profound sense of loss, but also a grim, terrifying calm. The decision was now final, etched in the ashes on her windowsill. She would walk down the aisle. She had destroyed the map, but the destination still held the same dread. The night before the wedding, Pastor John sat with Eliza in the living room, surrounded by the towering, fragrant boxes of gifts. He didn't speak about Thomas or the service. Instead, he talked about his faith not as a creed, but as a commitment to stability. "The world is a very uncertain place, Eliza," he said, his large hands resting on his knees. People crave peace. They need to know that some things, like the cornerstone of this church, are always going to hold fast. When you marry Thomas, you become part of that cornerstone. You show this town that even in marriage, there is order, there is responsibility, and there is deep, abiding peace. He wasn't demanding. He was simply laying out the truth of his world, the value he placed on her compliance. He looked at her then, his eyes, usually so focused on the sermon notes, filled with a deep, weary love. "You are my greatest joy, daughter, and I know you will be happy. Happiness is a choice, and you have chosen well." His words, meant to be comforting, landed like heavy stones. They confirmed that her decision wasn't just about her. It was about the church, the town, and her father's entire life's work. She couldn't tell him that she felt no peace, only a churning, guilty unease. She couldn't tell him that her choice felt more like a sentence handed down by a silent jury. She simply nodded, offering him a small, weak smile that cost her everything. The emotional weight of the conversation was crushing. It solidified the conflict from a personal dilemma to a public obligation. Ben didn't sleep either. He spent the night in his truck, parked by the river, staring at the old oak where the blue ribbon, the signal, the promise, was tied to a low-hanging branch. He knew the odds were against him. He knew Eliza's deep, almost crippling sense of duty to her father. But he had seen the flicker in her eyes, that undeniable moment of recognition when their eyes met, and he knew that the woman he loved was still there, trapped behind the proper exterior of the pastor's daughter. He clutched the sheet music for the recessional, the childhood tune, which he had rewritten with a desperate, soulful complexity. It wasn't a standard tune anymore. It was a rallying cry, a final, beautiful shout into the dark. If she heard it, if she remembered the feeling of freedom that tune represented, perhaps, just perhaps, she would turn away from the altar. He had his own conflict to manage. The deep respect he held for Pastor John, a man who had guided him through his own rough youth, battling the overpowering desire to steal his daughter away from a predictable, joyless future. He had told himself for years that he wasn't worthy of her, a struggling musician in a town that valued stability over art. But now, seeing her pale and distant, he realized worthiness was irrelevant. Love demanded action, even reckless, destructive action. The blue ribbon was his last, bold, desperate prayer. He felt the cold October air, and knew the sun would soon rise on the Sunday she wore white. The wedding day dawned with a deceptive, perfect beauty. The sky was that impossibly clear, crisp blue unique to a perfect southern autumn morning. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of the church, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny, hesitant ghosts. The air in the house was a whirlwind of hairspray, starched lace, and nervous, hushed excitement. Eliza was pale, but her movements were automaton-like, perfectly executing the steps laid out by her mother and the waiting bridesmaids. She refused breakfast, claiming a tight stomach, and instead retreated into the quietest corner of her room, staring at the dress, now hung on a satin hanger. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it felt like the uniform of a different person, a respectable stranger. Her only consolation was the memory of the secret music. Ben's note, now ashes, had left a residue of purpose. She would walk the aisle, she would stand at the altar, but she would listen. The moment of truth wouldn't be when her father handed her to Thomas. It would be in the space between the hymns, when Ben would play their childhood secret tune for the final time. She was staking her entire future on a melody, on the hope that the music would either give her the strength to say, "I do," or the courage to say, "I won't." The suspense of the impending moment was a physical ache, centered right behind her breastbone. Thomas arrived at the church an hour early, immaculate in his dark suit, his face a mask of quiet confidence. He greeted the ushers, shook hands with Pastor John, and surveyed the sanctuary. It was perfect, a testament to order and stability. He was a man who planned his crops, his finances, and his life, and Eliza was the centerpiece of his best-laid plan. He saw Ben, already seated at the piano, running a quick arpeggio. Thomas walked over, his heavy footsteps echoing in the empty church. Ben looked up, his eyes direct and challenging. "I trust you remember my request, Ben," Thomas said, his voice low and firm. "Only the music on the program. No improvisations." Ben's fingers paused on the keys. "The postlude is listed as joyful, joyful. We adore thee, Thomas. That's what I'll play. But the feeling, the interpretation, that belongs to the music." Thomas bristled. "I want respectability, not a concert, Ben. Remember where you are." Ben smiled, a slow, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I remember exactly where I am, Thomas. And I remember who is standing at this altar. I wouldn't dare disrespect the moment." The thinly veiled threat in Ben's words hung heavy in the air. Thomas walked away, his confident stride slightly off-kilter, recognizing for the first time that the pianist was not merely hired help, but a silent, vital combatant in a war Thomas hadn't known he was fighting. The music was the only thing Thomas couldn't own, and that realization was a subtle, unexpected source of paranoia. The guests began to arrive, filling the polished wooden pews. The sound of their murmuring voices, the rustle of their fine clothes, and the collective anticipation created a palpable wave of energy. Eliza watched them through a crack in the door of the small vesting room, seeing faces she had known her entire life. Friends, neighbors, the people whose judgment she feared most. Each face was a witness, a person who expected her to perform the role assigned to her. The pressure was enormous, an invisible weight pressing her into the floor. She thought about Ben's note again, the memory of the ashes, and wondered if she was a coward. Why had she destroyed the only evidence of a viable escape? Was it fear of scandal, or was it a deeper, more profound fear of the unknown, of the difficult, unconventional life Ben represented? The organist began to play the soft prelude, a familiar, comforting melody, but it felt to Eliza like a funeral dirge. She looked at her reflection, the perfect bride, the epitome of Southern grace, and she felt utterly disconnected from the person staring back. The image was a beautiful lie. The wedding planner tapped on the door. 5 minutes, Eliza. The procession is about to begin. 5 minutes until the lie became a vow. 5 minutes until she sentenced herself to Thomas's predictable sunroom and quiet control. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the sound of Ben's music, her only true guide. The moment arrived. The massive oak doors of the sanctuary opened, and the bridal march began. The music was powerful, majestic, the organist pulling out all the stops. Eliza took her father's arm, the heavy lace of her sleeve rubbing against his dark suit jacket. Pastor John's hand was warm and steady, a reassuring weight, and his presence was the final push of duty she needed. As they started down the aisle, her gaze locked forward, past the rows of smiling, weeping faces, past the riot of white flowers, straight to the altar where Thomas stood, his posture rigid, his face impassive. But her peripheral vision caught a flash of dark hair and intense focus at the piano. Ben was there, waiting. The air was charged with a terrible electricity. She walked slowly, a queen on her way to coronation or sacrifice, the heavy silk dragging slightly on the polished floor. She could hear the quiet sniffles, the appreciative murmurs, and the powerful, booming music, but all of it seemed distant, muffled by the internal clamor of her heart. Every step was a step away from her true self and deeper into the acceptable facade. She was almost halfway down the aisle when she consciously focused on Ben's face, catching the intensity of his gaze. A look that said, "I am playing what they want now, but I have a loaded weapon waiting for the end." The ceremony moved with the solemn, inevitable rhythm of a practiced ritual. The scripture readings were read, the vows were exchanged. Eliza's voice a thin, reedy whisper that surprised even herself. The words "I do" felt like pebbles dropped into a deep, silent well. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, and this time, the weight of the gold and diamond felt like a shackle. They turned to face the congregation for the prayer. It was at this moment that the music shifted. The organist finished the last note of the traditional hymn, and a brief, silent interlude descended on the church, a moment of breath-holding anticipation. Then, Ben started. He didn't play a hymn. He didn't play the postlude listed on the program. He played the old, familiar tune. The melody they used to whistle when they were 10 years old, skipping flat river rocks in the afternoon sun. A song about runaway freedom and impossible dreams. It was simple, yet his arrangement transformed it, filling it with the history of their shared youth, the sorrow of their present choice, and the desperate yearning for a different path. The melody was unmistakable to Eliza, a secret handshake in a crowded room. The music was a physical blow, a sudden rush of cold, cleansing river water in the suffocating heat of the church. The congregation shifted uneasily, recognizing that the tune was not one of the sanctified hymns, but they couldn't place the familiarity. They only knew it was intensely emotional, raw, and completely inappropriate for a wedding. Pastor John, standing at the altar, frowned, his expression hardening as he glanced towards the piano. But he was too far along in the ceremony to stop it. Thomas, however, reacted immediately. He glared at Ben, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. A sudden, fierce flash of the possessive control he usually kept hidden. He squeezed Eliza's hand, a painful, warning grip that was meant to sever her connection to the music. But the melody had already done its work. It was weaving a spell, pulling her back to the riverbank, back to the wild, reckless girl she was before duty chained her. She pulled her hand free from Thomas's grip, a small, yet profoundly rebellious movement. She was breathing heavily, seeing the whole, beautiful, terrible lie of her life laid bare by Ben's challenging, impossible music. The congregation held its breath, sensing the silent confrontation unfolding between the altar and the piano bench.